The desert stretched like an endless sheet of dying fire, its horizon blurred by heat that shimmered and bent the sky into wavering illusions. A single figure moved through it, her steps faltering, her breath ragged. The Apache woman had walked until her feet bled, until the wind itself felt like sandpaper against her skin. She had not eaten in 2 days. The water she once carried was gone, poured out in desperation onto lips that stayed cracked and dry. She whispered to the earth with each staggering step, prayers half remembered from her mother's voice, though the words faltered on her tongue. The desert listened in silence. Her legs buckled, and she dropped to her knees, the stones beneath tearing into flesh she no longer felt. She pressed her palm into the dust and thought of rivers she would never see again, of the drumbeats that once told her heart it belonged. That sound had long been taken from her. She lifted her face to the sky, which was neither kind nor cruel, only vast, and closed her eyes, expecting nothing but the quiet embrace of death. It was then she felt arms. At first she thought it a trick of the heat, a dream clinging to her as she slipped away. But the weight was real, the rough fabric of a shirt brushing against her cheek, the strength of calloused hands beneath her shoulders. She tried to fight it, a weak resistance born of fear. White men had only ever brought her chains or sorrow. Yet she was too frail for struggle, her body surrendering as the stranger lifted her into his arms. The man carrying her said nothing. His breath was steady, his gait purposeful as he moved across the sand. She caught only glimpses of him, a jaw darkened by stubble, a hat pulled low against the sun, eyes shadowed and unreadable. She let herself drift into darkness, unsure if she was being saved or claimed. When she woke, it was to the smell of cedar smoke and something faintly sweet, bread coarse but warm. She opened her eyes slowly. A cabin roof loomed above her, beams aged by time and weather. The bed beneath her was firm but clean, the blanket woolen and smelling faintly of horses. She drew in a breath, sharp with fear, and pushed herself upright. Her body ached. Her lips stung. Yet she was alive. The cowboy was there, across the room, seated at a wooden table with a lantern flickering beside him. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn shirt, his back straight, movements deliberate as he sharpened a knife against a stone. He did not look at her immediately, though he surely knew she stirred. Instead, he finished his motion with slow precision, set the blade aside, and then raised his eyes. They were not cruel eyes. They were not eager either. They carried the heaviness of someone who had learned silence as a language. He inclined his head slightly, not as greeting, not as command, but something in between, a simple acknowledgement that she was awake. On the small table beside the bed sat a cup of water, a piece of bread, and nothing more. She reached for the cup, her hand trembling. The water was cool and sharp in her throat, making her cough. He watched, but did not move closer. When she reached for the bread, he turned back to his work, leaving her the privacy of hunger. Suspicion gnawed at her. Men did not give without price. Her people had learned that lesson in blood and ash. She studied him, looking for the snare, the shadow of intent. Yet his face gave little away. He was not handsome, not in the way of young warriors or polished townsmen. His features were cut from the same lines as the land, rough, weathered, steady. Still, fear coiled tight in her chest. She swung her legs from the bed, testing her weight. Pain shot up from her blistered feet, but she forced herself upright, determined to face whatever waited. The cowboy rose as well, not quickly, but with a kind of deliberate calm, as if not to startle her. "You'll fall," he said at last, his voice low, more graveled in tone. The words startled her. She understood his language, though she had not heard it spoken gently before. She wanted to answer, but her throat clamped shut. She steadied herself on the wall, refusing to be seen weak. He did not approach. Instead, he moved toward the door, pulled it open, and stepped outside, leaving it ajar behind him. The message was clear enough: she was not his prisoner. She could leave if she wished, stumble back into the desert, and let it finish what it began. She sank back onto the bed, exhaustion forcing her surrender. The bread tasted coarse on her tongue, but each bite revived her strength. She listened to the faint sounds of him outside, the scrape of wood being stacked, the soft creak of a water bucket lifted. No chains clinked. No threats echoed. Only the ordinary rhythm of work. Night fell slowly, shadows stretching across the cabin floor like long fingers. She lay awake, tense with the knowledge that this man had given her his bed while he worked beneath lantern light. She wanted to believe there was no trap. Yet trust was a luxury she no longer carried. Her mind drifted back to the desert, to the moment she surrendered to death. She remembered how the ground had felt like an old mother calling her home, how she had whispered for release. And yet here she was, wrapped in warmth, her heartbeat steadying in a place she never expected. When the lantern was finally dimmed, he lay on the floor by the fire, a blanket pulled over his broad frame. The crackle of flames softened the silence, their glow painting his profile in copper. He looked older in sleep, the kind of man who had lost more than he spoke of. She turned onto her side, eyes wide, chest tight. The cabin walls felt both sheltering and confining, her mind torn between gratitude and dread. Still, she could not deny the truth that clawed at her chest. She was alive because of him. The fire whispered low as she closed her eyes once more. For the first time in many nights, her dreams did not begin with running. But when she woke again, just before dawn, she found him already seated by the door, rifle resting across his knees. He was watching the horizon, as if waiting for something, or someone. She lay back, heart quickening. Whoever this man was, whatever he had brought her into, she was not free yet. And outside, the land still held dangers that would not be kept away forever. The cabin breathed with the rhythm of wood and silence. Morning light poured through the single window, slanting in stripes across the floorboard. Dust floated lazily, as if even it moved with caution in this space. The woman sat on the edge of the bed, her hair tangled, her hands resting still in her lap. Across the room, the cowboy poured water from a clay jug into a tin cup and set it down on the table without a word. His movements carried no urgency, only habit, as though she were another piece of the cabin itself, a presence acknowledged, not questioned. She watched him warily, her dark eyes quick and measuring. He had saved her, yes, but survival had taught her that rescue was often just another kind of captivity. She lifted the cup, drank slowly, never letting her gaze fall from him. He noticed, though he did not return her stare. Outside, the world stirred. A horse snorted in the corral, the creak of leather harness echoed faintly. The sounds told her this man lived alone, lived simply. The absence of other voices made her chest loosen, though only a little. She rose from the bed, walking unsteadily toward the door, wanting to see the land, to know where she had been taken. The cowboy was already there, leaning against the frame with his hat tilted low. He stepped aside as she pushed the door open, letting her pass first. The morning struck her with its sharp clarity, sagebrush glowing silver in the rising sun, the mountains looming blue in the distance, their ridges carved like sleeping giants. It was beautiful, painfully so, but it was not freedom. The cabin sat isolated, a lone mark upon the vastness, and her heart tightened at the thought of how far she would have to walk to be beyond reach. He followed her out, his boots crunching against the earth. "You're weak still," he said, his voice carrying no demand, only observation. She ignored him, stepping farther into the open. Her body trembled, but she lifted her chin, refusing to let him see fear. The wind pulled strands of hair across her face. For a brief moment she felt the sky pressing down, enormous and unbroken, as though daring her to claim it again. He busied himself with the horse, checking hooves, tightening straps, giving her distance. She noticed how deliberate it was. He neither caged her with words nor shadowed her steps. That restraint unsettled her more than threats would have. Men always wanted something. Why did this one act as if he didn't? Later, when the sun climbed higher, he brought her food. Beans, a small portion of dried meat, all laid on the table without ceremony. She sat opposite him, the table a barrier and a bridge both. He ate sparingly, his eyes fixed not on her but on the fire. She studied the scars on his knuckles, the way his shoulders curved forward slightly, as if carrying weight invisible. At length, she found her voice rough with disuse. Why? He looked up. Why what? Why save me? For a moment he said nothing. He set his fork down, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, because you were dying. No explanation beyond that. No price named. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, not of shame but of frustration. People did not act without reason. Yet pressing him further felt dangerous, as though she might awaken something best left asleep. The day passed with its simple rhythm. He chopped wood, carried water, mended a harness. She sat in the shade, watching, the suspicion within her slowly shifting into something more complex. He was not kind in the way of men who sought favors. His kindness was work itself, measured, plain, without embellishment. It was near sundown when a rider approached, the sound of hooves carrying over the plain. She stiffened, every muscle taut, ready to flee. The cowboy straightened from where he knelt near the horse, his hand brushing the dust from his jeans. The rider, a stout man with a red face and a grin that did not reach his eyes, swung down from his saddle. "Evenin', Caleb," he called, familiarity laced with a mocking edge. His gaze shifted, landing on her. His grin widened. "Well now. Didn't reckon you'd gone to keep company with an Indian girl." Her breath caught in her throat. Shame and fear surged together, though she kept her face hard. The cowboy's jaw tightened, though his voice remained low. "She's not your concern, Miller." The man laughed, spitting into the dirt. "Not my concern? Out here, everything's everyone's concern. Folks see an Apache in your cabin, they'll have questions. Questions with answers that don't end easy." The woman's stomach knotted. She expected the cowboy to falter, to step aside, to let the man take her as others had before. But instead, he stepped forward, placing himself between her and Miller, his frame solid, immovable. "She stays here." The air went still. Miller's grin faltered, replaced with irritation. He gave a harsh chuckle, swung back onto his horse, and spat again. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Men don't take kindly to strangers. Especially not her kind." With a tug on the reins, he rode off, leaving dust swirling in his wake. Her heart pounded, her breath sharp in her chest. She waited for the cowboy to turn on her, to demand explanation, to question why she had brought danger to his door. Instead, he returned to the corral, his voice even, as though the encounter were nothing. "You'll be safe here." She stared at him, stunned by the simplicity of his words. Safe was not something she had felt in years. The very notion unsettled her more deeply than Miller's threats. That night she could not sleep. She lay in the bed while the fire cracked softly, watching his shape stretched out on the floor. The memory of Miller's words gnawed at her. She knew what men did when fear and hatred guided their hands. She knew she could not stay here without bringing ruin upon them both. And yet when she closed her eyes, she saw not Miller's sneer, but the quiet way the cowboy had stepped in front of her, as if his body were shield enough against the world. Her chest ached with a strange, foreign sensation, something close to gratitude, something close to longing. She turned her face into the pillow, willing it away. But the sound of his breathing near the fire carried her into uneasy dreams, where for the first time the desert did not chase her. Instead, it was a wall of faceless men, and in front of them stood the cowboy, silent, steady, his shadow stretching long. When she woke in the still hours before dawn, the fire had gone to embers, and the room lay hushed. She sat up, listening. Outside, a coyote howled, distant but clear. She felt the truth pressing in on her. Whatever place she had stepped into, it was no longer only her fight. And from beyond the horizon, she sensed the world already turning toward them, footsteps of trouble carried on the wind. The days began to settle into a rhythm, though it was not a rhythm either of them had chosen. She rose with the dawn, her body still frail but steadier than before, and found the cowboy already awake, working in silence. He never woke her, never asked for help, but she could not remain idle. She began to sweep the dust from the cabin floor, to wash the tin cups, to mend what she found frayed. At first, her hands trembled with suspicion, convinced that repayment would one day be demanded. Yet no demand ever came. One morning, as she stood by the fire, he approached with a small bundle of beans and set them beside her. His voice was quiet, almost careful. "Boil them slow. Fire too hot, they turn bitter." She nodded, surprised at the instruction. Until then, his words had been few and functional. She did as he said, stirring the pot while the scent grew rich. When he tasted the meal, his face softened with the faintest shadow of approval. It was the first moment that felt less like survival and more like living. In the evenings, he showed her how to brew coffee the cowboy's way, coarse grounds boiled in a dented pot. The bitterness of it startled her, but he smiled faintly when she coughed. She countered by teaching him the Apache word for dawn, ****. He repeated it clumsily, the syllables thick on his tongue, but he did not mock himself. He simply tried again. That patience unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Gradually, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers but the quiet that grows between people who have learned to breathe in rhythm. She found herself studying his movements, the way he tied knots, the way his hand brushed the horse's mane as though speaking to it in a language deeper than words. There was no vanity in him, no display. Everything he did carried the gravity of necessity. One afternoon she discovered a torn shirt folded at the foot of the bed. The rip was small, near the shoulder. She picked it up, turning the fabric in her hand. Something compelled her to take needle and thread, though her fingers shook. She mended it slowly, each stitch pulling her tighter into a life she did not intend to share. When he found the shirt repaired, he touched the seam with his thumb and gave a small nod. No thanks spoken, yet his eyes lingered on her longer than before. Still, the memory of Miller's visit gnawed at her. The way the man's laughter had curled like smoke, the way his words carried threat. She knew hatred when she saw it. She also knew that hatred was seldom content with leaving quietly. She began to dream of fire, cabins burning, men shouting, faces twisted with rage. Each morning, she woke with her breath sharp and her eyes darting to the door, expecting intruders. The cowboy never pressed her to explain. When she woke trembling, he would leave a tin cup of water nearby, nothing more. That restraint was its own kind of mercy, and it began to strip away the armor she had worn for years. One evening, as the sun melted into crimson light, she stepped outside. The air was cool, scented with sage, the horizon stretching wide and empty. He joined her, not too close, his presence quiet as always. They stood without words, watching as the first stars began to prick the sky. For the first time, she did not feel the urge to run. The next day brought a reminder of the world beyond their fragile peace. In town, whispers had spread. A widow who sometimes sold eggs to the cowboy rode past and glimpsed her at the well. Her eyes widened, her lips tightened, and she rode on without greeting. The woman knew what that meant. Gossip would bloom, twisting like thorn vines, and soon enough men would come with questions sharper than Miller's. That night she could not keep her silence. "They will not stop," she murmured as he sat by the fire, mending a leather strap. He looked up, waiting. "They will come again," she said. "For me. And for you, because you gave me shelter." His hands stilled, the leather strap falling into his lap. He studied her, his gaze steady, his expression carved in patience. "Let them come." Her chest tightened, torn between relief and fear. She had never heard those words spoken for her before. Not from her kin, not from anyone. It felt dangerous to lean on them. Yet something in his voice told her he meant it. Days stretched into weeks. Together they carried water, tended the horse, gathered wood. The work stitched them closer, thread by invisible thread. Still, the threat of the outside world hovered like storm cloud. Each creak of saddle leather on the wind made her heart jump.
Then, one evening, as she prepared the fire, he came to her side and placed something on the table. A small pouch of tobacco, worn but neatly folded. "For trade," he said simply. "If you need coin or if you choose to leave." She froze, the pouch heavy in her palm. Leave. The word should have felt like salvation. Instead, it cut like a blade. She had told herself she was only enduring here, waiting for strength to return. But when he offered her freedom, her chest ached with something she could not name. "I have nowhere," she whispered, almost to herself. He gave no reply, only turned back to the fire, his profile lit by the glow. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried weight, like an answer unspoken. That night she lay awake long after the fire dimmed, staring at the ceiling beams. She realized she no longer dreamed of the desert, no longer of death. Instead, she dreamed of a place where silence itself was a shelter, where a man could stand without asking, and a woman could rest without running. Yet even in that fragile safety, fear pressed close. For safety was not something the world allowed her kind to keep. And when she heard the distant echo of hooves on the horizon, faint but certain, she knew that the storm she dreaded was already finding its way back to them.
Under the wide breath of the evening sky, the ranch seemed to exhale. Shadows stretched long across the dry earth, their fingers reaching toward the barn where lantern light flickered faintly, a single warm glow against the coming dark. Eliza stood at the threshold, arms folded tight, her gaze locked on the horizon. The day had carried her further into this life than she had ever intended, binding her to a place that was never meant to be hers, to children that were not hers, and to a man who remained more ghost than flesh. Still, something in the air tonight felt restless, as though the wind itself whispered of things unsettled. Inside, the children sat cross-legged around the kitchen table, their supper bowls emptied and their chatter softened into a kind of watchful hush. It was always the same after sundown, a waiting, a listening for footsteps that never came. The littlest, Sarah, leaned her cheek against the table's edge, her eyes half closed, whispering, "Maybe tomorrow." The others glanced quickly at Eliza, as though gauging her reaction, and she managed only a small nod, unwilling to rob them of the thin thread of hope they still clutched. She tried to busy herself with washing dishes, yet every scrape of tin against tin only echoed the hollow quiet of the room. The ranch was heavy with absence. John's absence. His name had scarcely been spoken aloud since her arrival, and yet everything bore his mark: the boots by the door, worn and waiting, the rifle above the mantel, polished but unused, the chair that remained untouched at the head of the table. When the night deepened, Eliza tucked the younger children into their narrow beds, smoothing back hair, pressing soft reassurances against their fears. The older ones lingered, restless in their own way, caught between childhood trust and the ache of understanding more than they wished. Samuel, at 15, stood at the window, jaw tight, staring into the darkness like he might force it to reveal answers. His silence carried weight, and Eliza longed to reach him, yet the boy was already building walls she feared she could not cross. Later, alone in the small chamber that had been hastily offered as hers, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the single candle flame. Her hands trembled in her lap, her thoughts caught between past and present. She had answered an advertisement promising security, partnership, perhaps even love. Instead, she had walked into a life undone, into the bones of a promise left half fulfilled. She should have run, should have boarded the next wagon east. Yet when she pictured leaving, she saw only the children's faces, eyes wide with fear, fragile with need, and something in her own heart refused to abandon them. The following morning brought a sharp wind from the north. Dust swirled along the yard as Eliza stepped out with the pail, her skirts tugging at her legs. She moved with determination, yet her mind remained clouded. A sound carried over the wind then, a horse's hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth. She turned swiftly, squinting into the rising sun, and saw a figure approaching from the trail. Her breath caught. The children spilled from the house, their shouts rising, torn between hope and uncertainty. Samuel's face lit with sudden recognition before quickly hardening again. The rider drew nearer, a tall man astride a bay stallion, shoulders broad beneath a weather-worn coat, hat pulled low over eyes shadowed by years of hardship. As he reined in, the dust settling around him, Eliza felt her heart lurch. John. Alive. Flesh and blood. His presence struck like a storm breaking after long drought. He dismounted with a slow, weary motion, his gaze sweeping across the yard, pausing on each child as though counting blessings he had nearly lost. His face bore the scars of dust and distance, lines carved deep by grief and endurance. When his eyes finally found Eliza, something unreadable flickered there, surprise, caution, and perhaps the faintest hint of anger. "Papa!" Sarah whispered, then broke into a run. The others followed, colliding into his arms, their laughter tangled with sobs. He gathered them close, burying his face in their hair, his voice low and ragged as he murmured words none of them had heard in months. Eliza stood apart, her pulse racing, unable to move. She had imagined this moment countless times, yet never like this, never with him staring at her as though she were an intruder in his home. When the children quieted, John lifted his head, his voice carrying across the distance. "Who are you?" The question cut deeper than she expected. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The children, suddenly aware of the divide, clung tighter to him, glancing between father and stranger. Samuel stepped forward, his tone sharp. "She's been here. Taking care of us. Keeping us fed." John's gaze never left her. "That's so?" His words bore no gratitude, only suspicion. Eliza forced her voice steady. "I came by train. The letter said the children needed a mother." The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy with things unspoken. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "That letter was never mine to send." The wind swept the yard, rattling the porch boards, sending a chill through Eliza's spine. In that moment, she understood, his absence had been no accident, no misfortune of travel. He had chosen to leave them, and someone, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps Samuel himself, had called her here in desperation. Her breath faltered. The children's eyes darted between them, wide with dread of what this revelation might mean. Eliza's heart ached, not only for herself but for them. She had stepped into a life on the belief of a promise, and now she stood before the man whose refusal had ridden the wound they bore. John took a step closer, his boots grinding against the dirt. "You've no claim here," he said lowly, his voice carrying an edge that made the air taut. "Whatever bargain you thought you made, it wasn't with me." Eliza's hands clenched at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to speak, to fight, yet her tongue felt heavy, her chest tight. Behind him, the children huddled, torn between father and the woman who had kept them safe in his absence. The line drawn in the dirt was clear, and it threatened to break them all. Then Samuel's voice cut through the tension, raw with fury. "You left us." John turned, startled. The boy's face blazed with anger, his fists trembling. "You left us to starve, to be alone. She stayed. Not you. Her." The air seemed to fracture, the fragile world they stood upon splintering beneath them. John's eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, but he masked it quickly, straightening his shoulders. Eliza's heart thundered as she watched father and son face each other, knowing the fragile balance of this family hung in the silence between them. And in that silence, she realized, this was not simply about her place in the house. It was about the wound that absence had carved, a wound that no return could easily mend. The candlelight of hope she had tried to nurture in the children now trembled against the gathering storm. She met John's gaze across the space, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Then tell me, sir, why come back at all?" His answer, when it came, was as sharp as a knife and twice as cold. "Because someone has to decide who stays, and who goes." The words struck like a gunshot, leaving the children silent, Eliza breathless, and the night settling heavy with the weight of what was to come. Under the solemn hush of a rising dawn, the ranch stirred with the kind of brittle stillness that comes before a storm. Dust still clung to the air from yesterday's commotion, the unexpected return of Charlotte's brother, his bitter words, the accusations that had cut like spurs against tender skin. Evelyn lay awake through the night, her body still and her mind alive with restless fire. Each breath she drew carried the ache of decisions yet to be made, of a home she feared might crumble if truth and loyalty failed to bind it together. At her side, the child who had first tugged her dress at the station slept with a hand curled into her sleeve, as if sensing her heart's battle. When morning finally pressed light through the cracks in the shutters, Evelyn rose. The floorboards whispered under her weight as she crossed the room. She opened the door to find Caleb already outside, his tall figure framed by the cool gray of dawn. He stood beside the corral fence, hands braced on the rails, his posture taut as though the very earth beneath him had become unsteady. The horses shifted restlessly behind him, as if feeding off his unease. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft yet edged with the strain of someone who already knew the answer. Caleb turned, his eyes shadowed from sleeplessness, yet burning with a restrained fury. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Him standing there in my yard, spitting venom like he had the right to tear apart everything we've built." Evelyn moved closer, the hem of her dress dragging across the dust. "He's your blood, Caleb. That makes it harder, but it doesn't make him right. You saw how the children clung to you. How they looked to you." His jaw tightened, the cord of muscle in his neck straining. "And he saw it too. That's why he came. To remind me of debts, of failings. To make me believe this family doesn't belong to me." His voice cracked, revealing the wound beneath the anger. "But it does. It belongs to us." Evelyn placed her hand against his chest, feeling the quick thunder of his heart. "Then don't let him take it. Families aren't stolen, they're abandoned. And you have not abandoned yours." For a moment silence held them. The kind of silence that mends, even while fear gnaws at the edges. Caleb lowered his forehead to hers, closing his eyes as if drawing strength from the simple nearness. But the reprieve was brief. By noon, word had spread that Charlotte's brother had returned to town, filling saloon corners with poison about the ranch, about Caleb, about Evelyn herself. The whispers slithered like smoke into every ear, twisting doubt where trust had begun to grow. When Evelyn rode into town with two of the children for supplies, she felt the shift immediately. Faces that once held cautious warmth now turned cold. A woman who had shared bread with her just weeks before crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Inside the general store, the silence pressed heavier than the weight of the baskets she carried. The shopkeeper, usually quick with a nod, hesitated before taking her coin. Evelyn felt the children shrink behind her skirts, their small bodies sensing the hostility like wolves scenting danger. As they mounted to return home, a voice cut through the thick air. "You best think twice before tying your fate to that ranch, miss. Some names carry curses." Evelyn's spine stiffened, though her hands trembled around the reins. She refused to look back. Instead, she urged the horse forward, the children clinging tight to her sides. The ride home became a blur, her mind burning with the choice before her: retreat into silence, or stand and fight for the fragile family she had begun to claim as her own. When she returned, she found Caleb pacing the porch, his hands raw from gripping tools too long, working wood until splinters cut into his skin. He read her face before she could speak. "They turn on you," he said, each word a stone. "Yes," she whispered. "But only because lies run faster than truth." His fists clenched, the muscles in his arms trembling. "Then we'll give them truth they can't ignore. We'll show them this family is no mistake, no shame, no weakness. We'll show them we belong." That night, with the children gathered close, Evelyn and Caleb spoke in low tones by the hearth. They spoke of what they feared, the brothers' schemes, the town's judgment, the cracks of old grief reopening. But beneath it all, a vow began to take shape. Not one spoken in grand declarations, but built in the way their eyes met, the way their hands brushed across the table, the way the children leaned against them as though their bodies already knew what their hearts were deciding. Days bled into one another with a strange intensity. Work became fiercer, more deliberate, as though every nail driven into wood, every row plowed, every meal cooked carried defiance within it. Evelyn rose earlier, her skirts brushing dew-soaked grass as she fed chickens, her hands steady even when her heart was not. Caleb labored until dusk, sweat streaking his brow, his voice hoarse from calling the cattle. And when the sun sank, they found each other in the hush of the house, their shared weariness deepening into something steadier than passion, an unspoken partnership that grew stronger with each test. Yet peace remained fragile. One evening, as cicadas shrilled in the trees and twilight painted the sky in bruised colors, a rider appeared on the horizon. Charlotte's brother. His horse thundered across the plain, his figure cutting sharp against the fading light. He dismounted with the arrogance of a man certain of his power. Caleb stepped onto the porch, Evelyn at his side. The children pressed against the window, their breath fogging the glass. "You think you can steal what's mine?" the brother called out, his voice carrying like a whip crack. "This ranch. These children. Even her." His gaze flicked toward Evelyn, sharp with cruelty. Caleb's voice was steady, but his fists were curled at his sides. "They were never yours to claim." The brother smirked, spitting into the dust. "We'll see who the town believes. We'll see who they follow when the truth's laid bare." Evelyn felt the weight of every watching eye, though no one stood there but the three of them. Her heart hammered, but she did not flinch. She slid her hand into Caleb's, letting him feel her resolve. Whatever storm came, they would not face it alone. The brother mounted again, his eyes glinting with threat. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow I come back. And when I do, you'll regret ever thinking you belong." As his figure vanished into the horizon, the silence he left behind was heavier than his words. Evelyn turned to Caleb, her throat dry, her eyes burning with both fear and fire. "Then tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "we show him who truly belongs.